everyone. Before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Angela Jiang-Wang, and I'm a fourth-year PhD student at LISER, also known as Luxembourg Institute of Socioeconomic Research here in Belval, and I'm doing my PhD in behavioral economics. So I use experiments mainly in my day-to-day research, and that's why I was invited today by Professor Philippe Van Kerm to give this special session on experimental research designs specifically applied to the social sciences. I personally like experiments a lot. I find them very cool. That's why I'm doing a PhD using them. And I hope that at the end of this session, I can at least make some of you at least a bit interested in them. That will make me happy. Experimental designs, they are also often called randomized controlled trials or RCTs. You will see these names used interchangeably. They nowadays they are still rare, at least compared to other research designs that are more popular. They are still rare in the social sciences, but they are being used more and more. So my own field, for example, behavioral economics, it has been expanding and growing a lot in the last 20 years, but also across all fields of social sciences, people are using experiments more and more. Why do we discuss them? Because according to the scientific community, the consensus nowadays is still that experimental designs are the best design to establish a causal relationship. That is to say, they are still nowadays the gold standard if I want to do a research project and at the end of my research project, I want to be able to claim that T causes Y. So even if you don't work with experiments yourself in your research, it's still good to at least be familiar with how they work and what are the assumptions behind them, because they can still be used as a yardstick or as a benchmark against which to compare all other research designs that are trying to establish causality. As I already said, the goal of experiments is to be able to say whether T causes Y by keeping every other potential explanatory factor equal and controlled. That is, I isolate in my experiment or I neutralize the potential effect of confounding factors Z that can also have an effect on Y. So I can truly say that T is the factor that is causing a change in Y. This sounds complicated, so what do I mean by this? Let's see an example. Imagine that you are interested in studying the relationship between walking and anxiety. So you do a survey, well, very easy. You do a survey and you ask people to tell you about how much they walk every day and how anxious they feel every day. And you collect some responses, you put the responses in a graph, and your data looks like this. So to walk you a little bit through this chart, in the y-axis here, we can see the times feeling anxious participants reported every day, and then the minutes participants worked every day, and you see these results. Can I say with these findings that working more is associated with less anxiety? That yes, I can say. There is a clear correlation here where the more participants work, the less anxious they seem to feel. So an association I can establish. But if my goal as a researcher was to try to find out whether working more reduces anxiety, with this data, it's impossible to say. Because yes, indeed, one potential reason why I find these results can be because working more reduces anxiety, but there are also a lot of other explanations going on that could also justify these results. For example, we could have a case where it just happens that the less anxious you are, the more you work. This is called in research reverse causality, where I'm trying to find whether T causes Y. So I'm trying to find as a researcher whether working more reduces anxiety. But reverse causality will mean that it's Y which is causing T. So here, maybe anxiety is causing people to work less. It can be because people who happen to live in a safe neighborhood, they work more. And also it can happen to be that precisely because people live in a safe neighborhood, they are also less anxious. So here it's not the working that is causing the anxiety levels to change, it's the fact that they are living in a safe neighborhood that is causing both. So this will be an example of a confounding factor where Z, living in a safe neighborhood, is causing both working more and is causing also a reduction in anxiety. And then there are many other potential explanations. These are only two examples I just came up with from the top of my head by looking at this graph, but there are a lot of potential explanations. So if I really, really wanted to do a research project where I can answer at the end of my research project whether working has any influence in anxiety, I will do an experiment. And my design will look something very similar to this. So I could take a group of anxious patients and I could randomly assign them to two groups. To one group, I will instruct them for the next 4 weeks for them to not work at all during the day. And another group, I can tell them that for the next 4 weeks, please every evening work at least 30 minutes. And then I measure their anxiety level before starting this intervention of working and after 4 weeks, what happened. And then my data looks like this. This is hypothetical data. This is not based on a real research study. It's just to illustrate as an example. Imagine that you find these results. So in the y-axis, again, same as before, these are the times per day participants have said to be feeling anxious. And then in the x-axis is the two groups. So these are the results of the group that I told them that for 4 weeks, please not work at all, so 0 minutes working. And this will be the results for the group that I told them to please work at least 30 minutes every day. Then the red bar will be the anxiety level before the intervention, so before the 4 weeks. And then the green bar will be the anxiety levels after the 4 weeks. And here we will see that for the group that I instructed them to not work at all, after 4 weeks, their anxiety level remained the same as since the beginning of the study. But for the group that I instructed them to work every day at least half an hour, we can see that after 4 weeks, their anxiety levels is much lower than at the start of the study or at the start of the intervention. Can I say then, with these results, that working more reduces anxiety? The answer is, as long as the experiment design was well designed, then yes, I can say it. So, as I already shown in the example before, how do experiments work at the end of the day? Very simply, the researcher simply manipulates levels of an independent variable. In here, it will be, in this example, it will be working. And you assign as a researcher randomly different levels of this treatment to participants in your experiment. So for example, here we assign randomly to some people to please work 30 minutes and to other people to not work at all, to work 0 minutes. And then the key factor here is that the levels of working, so the levels of your treatment, it's assigned artificially and externally by the researcher. It's not chosen by the participants themselves, or it's not determined by nature. So, and then the dependent variable y, in here it will be the anxiety level. You just measure it before and after the treatment, so you can see the effect of the treatment on y. Why can we say that this design works for causality? Because as long as you keep everything else equal, so imagine that the participants in these two groups are identical, they live in the same neighborhood, they have the same job, like you try to keep participants in the two groups as equal as possible. And I instructed them to work more or less, so I chose randomly. And so if these conditions are met and if this situation is true, then the changes I see between these two groups can only be explained by their difference in working, which is my treatment. This is the only thing that has changed between these two groups in the 4 weeks. So as long as this assumption is true, then any difference I observe between these two groups can only be explained by the treatment, the intervention, which is working. Caveat, this is true as long as the experiment has a good design. because there are many ways where you can design a bad experiment. Now here, these are only some examples, but there are many ways where experiments can be designed badly. Some examples is bad randomization, also known as selection bias. For example, imagine that in my study, participants that I assigned to the 0 minutes condition, they were already more anxious than the participants that I assigned to the 30 minutes working condition. Then differences I observe in anxiety levels between two groups can be explained by my treatment working. Can also be explained because already since the beginning, participants' anxiety levels were already different. Another example of bad experiment design, not controlling for potential alternative explanatory variables like confounding factors, in other words. For example, imagine that in my research project, I ask participants in the 0 minutes condition to report their anxiety on a Monday morning, and I ask participants in the 30 minutes working condition to report their anxiety in a Friday evening. This is a confounding factor because then I don't know if any difference in anxiety reported between these two groups are because of my intervention, the working intervention, or just because people are more anxious in a morning and less anxious on a Friday evening. So these are things that experimenters, when designing their research project, really need to be careful about, trying to keep things as equal as possible between both groups. Another example of bad design is a lack of a control group. What does this mean? This will mean that, for example, in the research project about working on anxiety, I never have a condition about not working at all. I instruct all participants in my study to every day work for 30 minutes, and I just see if their anxiety improves after 4 weeks. Why is this a bad design? I will come back to it, but meanwhile, if you want, you can try to guess. And finally, it can also be that my sample size is too small. This means that I don't have enough participants in my study. Because if in my study I ask, let's say, 100 participants, and I see that consistently 100 participants working, their anxiety level decreases, and another 100 participants that don't work, their anxiety remains the same, I can quite confidently say that working is doing something here. But if instead of 100 participants, I only ask 3 participants to do this, maybe these participants are the outliers. So they are maybe the exceptions to the rule. Maybe to the majority of people, working does something good to their anxiety, but just happen to be unlucky enough to take the 3 guys that working doesn't help them for anxiety. So it can be that it's important that you have enough amount of participants in your study. Otherwise, in research terms, you don't have enough statistical power to maybe detect an effect that maybe actually exists. Uh, so why do experiments work for causal inference? As I explained before, experiments are the best design known today for controlling or neutralizing potential confounders because I randomly assign the treatment. So, as I said, as long as every group is exactly the same in terms of confounding variables, and the only thing that changes between the two groups is my treatment, then first, it's impossible to have reverse causality because of the time order. Like reverse causality, it's impossible for more anxious people to work less because they work more or less depending on what I tell them to do. So it's not related to their anxiety at all, and it's the other way around. I instruct them to work, and then I see if the anxiety changes. So this already solves the reverse causality problem. And then the other reason is this, because if everything is equal and the only thing that changes is t, then t can only be the only explanation. So the objective of experiments at the end of the day is to isolate as much as possible the effect of t using a proper experimental design. Back to the importance of control groups in experiments. Control groups are really useful specifically to guard against the impact of time and against the impact of repetition. So time, for example, if I didn't have a control group here and all participants were only assigned to the 30 minutes walking, yes, after 4 weeks, I could see an improvement in anxiety. But I also don't know what happened in these 4 weeks. Maybe the weather got better. Maybe a presidential election got elected, like a president got elected in the elections that people really like. A lot of things could have been happening and changing the environment in these 4 weeks that could be explaining anxiety level reduction that is not only caused by working. But the idea is if I have a control group, so a group of participants who doesn't work, any changes in the environment during these 4 weeks, both of them should have been going through the same. So if the weather has improved, it has improved for everyone. If it's a holiday season, it's a holiday season for everyone. So then again, any changes in the anxiety level can only be explained by the only difference between these two groups, which is working. The other reason why control groups are important is because of testing or the effect of repetition. So this is very specific to depending on what you want to study. But repetition, the fact that you do things several times can also have an effect on you. Imagine that you want to do an experiment and find whether working more increases people's IQ, as an example. Uh, it can also be that people who does the IQ test several times, you naturally get better at it. So it can be that you are getting better at an IQ test not because of my intervention, but simply because of the mere repetition of keep doing tests. So if you have a control group also have this repetition effect, like the treatment group. So then again, any change between control and treatment is because of the intervention, not because of repetition. So because of these reasons, experimental research nowadays can give you a very strong confidence as a researcher in order to claim whether T has any causal effect on Y. The answer can be yes or no, but at least you can say that very confidently. And it has very, very high internal validity. Internal validity means that there are no other potential explanatory factors explaining the effect of T on Y. The effect of T on Y, you isolate it and it's very clean. What kind of experiments do we commonly find in the social sciences? So on the one hand, the most common ones are lab experiments and nowadays also field experiments. Lab experiments are often run in computer labs. For example, I want to test the effect that I want to simply study cooperation and social interactions. So I invite a group of people to a lab. I instruct them to do some tasks in a very controlled environment, keeping everything else equal, and then I just see how they behave. Usually, lab experiments have a relatively smaller number of participants, and very commonly still these participants usually are university students because of the convenience of accessing to them as a sample. And the good thing about lab experiments is usually the internal validity is very high because the environment is very controlled. The bad side of lab experiments is sometimes the external validity can be low. External validity means whether I can extrapolate the results I find in an experiment to the real world. We will talk more about external validity later today in the lecture. And lastly, increasingly, there is also online experiments where instead of in a computer lab, online experiments are usually website-based. People can do these experiments in their personal computers at their home or in smartphones. And this is also becoming increasingly a more popular option, but they function really similarly to lab experiments. On the other hand, we also have social experiments or field experiments. These are experiments that are usually run in like a real-life environment. For example, providing some service to job seekers, providing some disease prevention campaigns. The way this works is, for example, in a city, I have a company that is providing a service to job seekers, and in another city, I don't provide this service, and then I see what happens. So these are interventions that are run in real life with real life impact, which is very good for external validity. But on the other hand, the trade-off is these kind of experiments have less internal validity because you have less control over the environment. It's harder to keep both groups equal, so there is more noise going on. Let's see, now that I have given you an overview of how experiments work, what are they based on, it can be interesting for me to show you a case study of an example of an experimental research project that we have done in Luxembourg applied to policymaking. So I will be telling you about SOC 2050. This is a study that was commissioned by the Ministry of Economy in Luxembourg last year. It's a study focused on, so the Ministry of Economy asked us in LISER to study the sustainable and environmental practices of Luxembourg's residents and residents of neighboring areas. So we also included here the commuters, so the participants living at the border of Luxembourg that work inside of Luxembourg. And this study was carried by a team of researchers at LISER, including Philippe and I. And this was a longitudinal study. So if you remember, this should have already been explained by Philippe at this point. Longitudinal studies are studies where you follow the same panel of participants over time and you keep measuring some variables about them over time. So in this case, for example, we launched 3 waves of surveys, one in November, one in April, and one in July to the same people. Our sample here was 912 participants. They were all adults. And the goals of this research project was, on the one hand, to write a policy report for the ministry, but then also to use these findings for academic publications. In the first wave, what we did is we presented 6 hypothetical policies to participants. And these were all policies designed to either tax or restrict a behavior that is very unsustainable. So, for example, the 6 hypothetical policies we chose here were a rationing on fossil energy sources, a 10% tax on rental income from energy inefficient properties, a regulation on red meat production, an increase of the VAT on meat towards 17%, a €5 toll on using Luxembourg's motorways, and finally a ban on cars in densely populated areas. These were all hypothetical policies. And after explaining to them in more detail what every policy meant, we asked them first to state whether all participants will personally support these policies, yes or no. But then we also asked these participants to guess the proportion of other survey respondents that would say yes to the first question. So basically we asked, out of 100 survey respondents, how many do you think said yes to supporting each of these 6 policies? And if participants were accurate in their guesses, they were paid a bonus. So this question was incentivized. This is a very common practice in economic research to make sure that participants are not just guessing randomly, or the quality to make sure that participants are actually making effort in thinking and that the responses have some sense and they are not just writing whatever in the survey. Can you guess what we found? That participants were very, very pessimistic in their guesses. So as you can see here, this is the real proportion of people who said yes to supporting every policy. And here it's how the proportion that participants guessed on average that will support the policy. So for example, we actually like 64% of our sample supported regulation on red meat, but our participants thought that only 36% of the sample would support red meat. Consistently, participants underestimated the number of supporters for all policies. This pattern was true, like the effect was the largest in regulation of red meat, but this effect was consistent for all policies. And actually 4 of our hypothetical policies were supported by a majority. You can see here regulation on red meat, fossil fuel rationing, rental tax, and then ban on cars. But participants guessed that none of the policies will be supported by a majority. So we have these findings, and what we do in wave 2 is we design an experiment to correct these misperceptions of people. And then again, here we had two groups. Participants were randomly allocated to either the control group, where we didn't display any sort of information and they just kept on doing the survey as normal, or they were allocated to an information treatment condition, where we revealed to them the actual proportion of supporters for each policy in wave 1. What happened when we corrected their misperceptions? Participants in wave 2, after they were exposed to the treatments, they were asked once more to indicate their support for each of the policies, the same ones. And compared to the control group, the participants who were exposed to the treatment were 13% more likely to support regulation on red meat, and they were 9% more likely to support fossil fuel rationing. We didn't find any negative effects, thankfully, from our treatment for any of the other policies, so their support remained just equal between treated and control. And when we asked again 3 months later in wave 3, the effects persisted for regulation on red meat. So people who were exposed to the information treatments were still more likely to support that policy compared to participants in control, so participants who didn't read any information at all. And here in this design, the key element here is we can establish a causal inference. So here, because we had a control and we had a treatment group, we can say that correcting misperceptions about others' political attitudes causally changed participants' political attitudes. However, of course, I have been talking about experiments for a while, and now I have been saying all the good things about experiments and also the practical applications for how they could work if you wanted to do some policy making relevant research. But experiments are not a panacea. They also have, as all research designs, their limits and weaknesses. Some important limitations of experiments is experimental design are not compatible with all research questions. Basically, which is to say that a lot of important variables in social sciences cannot be manipulated by the researchers. If I want to study the effect on gender on something, I cannot randomly assign participants to different genders. If I want to study the effect of a country's GDP on something, I cannot randomly assign countries to different GDPs. So the good thing about experiments, the cool thing is the random assignation of what I want to study, but I cannot do that for everything. It depends a lot on my specific research question. So not all research projects can be done with an experiment. Then experiments can also raise ethical concerns. I will not discuss a lot today in this session, but an overview of potential ethical concerns could be that imagine again going back to that project where participants were assigned to either work or not, and then their anxiety was reduced. Is it fair that I only made half of my participants work more, but another half of my participants didn't work, so in the end their anxiety was not reduced? Is it fair that I don't give the treatment to everyone? So I already expect that some people will improve in my sample, but some people will not improve. Is it ethical? It's hard to say. Other ethical concerns, it could also be that you need to make sure that participants are treated well in our experiments. You treat them with respect. We have a lot of nightmare stories of bad experiments where participants were either psychologically damaged or not treated as their rights were not respected, let's say. So it's important nowadays for experimentalists to really be careful about the ethic implications, that you want to make sure that your participants will not be damaged at the end of your experiment. Another limitation is, as I already said, this has, again, going back to the issue of external validity. Not all experiments findings are so easy to extrapolate outside of the lab. Let me give you an example. Imagine that I want to study inequality. And the way I do it is I recruit some university students to my lab, and to some students I give them €1, and to other students I give them €10, and I artificially create a society with inequality, and then I see how they interact according to this. any changes between the two groups, as long as everything is equal for sure, can only be explained because some had €1 in the beginning of the experiment and some had €10. The internal validity can be high. But is it extrapolable to real life? Can I say that the same results will be applied to a real situation of inequality in a country? That was a very artificial environment. The 10 €1 were a proxy for inequality, but was very artificial. It's hard to say if it has high external validity. In other words, if my results about inequality can actually be applied in real life. Another problem is compliance. I cannot force participants in my experiment to keep participating in the experiment until the very end. So for example, again, in the research project about walking, maybe some participants quit the experiment midway and they don't complete the program and they just drop out of the experiment during those 4 weeks. Why is this a problem? Because maybe participants who drop out are not random. Maybe precisely the participants who are the most anxious are the ones who drop out the most from my study. It can be a myriad of reasons, but again, selection bias, dropout bias. My results can be explained simply because even if I assigned participants well in the two groups and the two groups are identical, after participants drop out, maybe my two groups are not identical anymore. There are some solutions to this. I'm not going to go in detail to this. For example, one solution is an analysis called intention to treat, but this is still a real problem in experimental work nowadays. And finally, the last limitation is, in practical terms, the scalability. So I can do an experiment where I instruct 100 people to work, and then I find that working is good for you for your anxiety. But what happens if I do this treatment for everyone? If everyone were to work in the neighborhood, will working still reduce anxiety? Maybe working works only because some people in the neighborhood work more, but if the entire neighborhood every day started working, we don't know. So the scalability of the treatments are also something important to consider. And if you want to learn more about experimental research and about research overall in social sciences, I definitely recommend you this set of bibliography. This is the report we wrote for the Ministry of Economy for the project about the hypothetical policies that I explained to you before. And thank you for listening to this lecture today. And I hope you have a nice day.